Tales from Gloryland, Lizzy Dixon. Story by Mitchell Peiffer. Your social score is 8.91, the bank teller happily announced with a smile that was maybe a subtle bit over-friendly. The social score was high indeed, as high as any normal person could be expected to get their score. This dirty, beard-stubbled, smelly man was one of the brave, hard-working individuals who put the Made in America stamp on more products than any other nation. He was the type of person you would expect to see getting breakfast at a local gas station at 6 a.m. He was a wonderful member of society with no skeletons in the closet that the government could be aware of. He was tall but not exquisitely so, with light hair that wasn't quite outright blonde. His beard was scruffy but not unkempt. He was young but not too young, probably in his late 20s, probably married with young children. He'd probably been awake since long before the sun rose, working for the construction company whose logo was on his sweatshirt. If he traded that for a sleeveless t-shirt, as she imagined he did during the humid summer months, his biceps would probably be enough to make Lizzy Dixon bite her lip and sneak a fourth or fifth glance. What his score said about him was that he loved his job and excelled at it, regardless of what his job was. He was probably one of the more competent employees at his company, despite his age. He might even be training one of the young dirt monkeys that the boss hired this month. During his time off work, he most likely got more than enough fulfillment from maintaining his house and his car, and watching brain-melting TV shows with his family and his pets. Those were his hobbies. He had no aspirations to be a writer, or an artist, or an entertainer, or a politician, or a philosopher. His social score told the world that he was exactly what he looked like. "Please step inside, we can discuss your loan options," sung the teller's voice. Lizzy shifted nervously in the upholstered waiting room seat. Her 18th birthday was yesterday, and this would be the first time she found out her social score. This score would weigh heavily on her employability, loan eligibility, higher education opportunities, travel privileges, tax rates, and many other important things in life. She was expecting her score to be low enough to make her parents angry again. As the dirty, hard-working, all-American man stepped into the bank office, another office door opened and a middle-aged woman walked from it towards the door, followed by yet another teller and another middle-aged woman. "Who's next?" the young newly minted woman said. Lizzy had a small tattoo on her wrist, and one too many ear piercings, which might have put off the teller a bit. She stood up and approached sheepishly. She knew it was bank policy to say every customer's social score out loud to the whole waiting room. This added more social weight to the number. The teller smiled and turned the tablet to face Lizzy, ready for SSN input. She keyed the numbers, the teller took the device back, and then, gazing at the screen, curled her lips in the nervous expression of a doctor telling a patient some very bad news. Lizzy's heart sank even before the teller apologetically said the number for all to hear. "Your social score is 2.37. Lizzy was expecting maybe a 3.7. This was quite a bit lower than that. She had had premarital sex with 3 people, none of whom her parents knew about, but that didn't mean the government was oblivious. She didn't expect it to be. Lots of people had sex, though, and she recalled one of her parents' friends, an employee for the Census Department, saying in casual conversation that up to 2 events between the ages of 14 and 18 could be overlooked with no score penalty. Her mind swam as she flashed back to the time she tried weed, then to a conversation she'd had with a close friend about feeling trapped by a future of wage labor. This was after they had both removed the batteries from their phones to prevent the microphones from recording. Lizzy thought back, then, to a pen pal she had in the UK, with whom she listened to Green Day and read 1984, and discussed how stupid reality TV was. Most of those conversations happened on a computer, through the open internet. How much of that was weighted into her score? These were normal kid things to do and talk about, weren't they? Suddenly she felt disgusted by the dirty man and his pride when the dumb bimbo read out his score. Lizzy was disgusted by his teller, too, and her fake happy voice and pristine outfit and all of it. She hated her and despised him. They were both sheep, devoid of substance in their personalities. "Please step inside, we can discuss your early adult life score options," the teller said. "What options?" Lizzy felt like she had none. Her score told the world loud and clear that she was exactly what she looked like. She was a rebellious punk refusing to grow up and would soon land in jail. The thing was, that wasn't what she felt like. She politely declined to discuss her options. Lizzy knew them well enough already. No respectable employer would hire her with such a low score. She would either have to do Fed Ed along with the accompanying community service tasks, that, of course, was in hopes of raising the score, work a shitty job, or go jobless and starve. The most promising possibility for the future of her family would be if she married a man with a social score similar to hers, had a child, who by some miracle managed to get a much higher score than either parent, and watch as the kid did everything she never could. Before she worried about that, though, she had to worry about her parents' reaction and about her own stupid feelings. As she opened the car door, she realized that she had a week to renew her underage driver's license. People with higher scores got more time. Shit. And people with higher scores also had to renew their licenses less often than once a month. Double shit. She took a box of cigarettes and the lighter from the glove box. The joy of no longer having to hide these was overshadowed by the thought that they probably had lowered her score. It was the police that fined people for underage smoking. The Census Department, which managed scores, probably didn't waste time reporting every little crime to the local cops, especially not when it put their information sources at risk. It was completely possible the feds knew she smoked long before the neighborhood PD. She hit the ignition and lowered the window as the radio started up, playing some fast music. Upon approaching the door, her parents could be heard talking in the kitchen of the one-floor house. Her brother, whom her parents made take the bus to not be unsupervised around a smoker, would probably be in the kitchen too, eating an after-school meal. They would notice the door. She had no hope of sneaking past, and they knew where she was today. The volume of the voices inside drained from the room when she entered. Upon closing the door quietly as possible, she turned towards the direction of her bedroom without a glance at them. "It was bad enough you don't even want to talk to your mother?" Her beloved matriarch quipped, half joking, only half expecting that to actually be the case. Ignoring her parents wasn't out of place in this family. Lizzy stopped and sighed, preparing herself for the strife to come. She slid a backpack strap off her shoulder, put it on the ground, after turning around. She said nothing, trying her best, it wasn't hard, to put on an annoyed expression, as if she had something better to do than allow her parents to mourn the version of their daughter they wished she would be. "How bad was it exactly?" Mom asked in a casual tone. She didn't look up from the dishes. Lizzy shrugged, wanting nothing more than to escape this questioning, but, as through hypnosis, not being able to make herself turn and walk away. "Lower than 5, her mother prodded. Lizzy could feel the muscles in her face tense up. 4.5? "A low score can be improved, Lizzy. That's the whole purpose of this program, to encourage people to improve," her father said. He looked up from the newspaper that he was reading. Her brother, Nathan, was quiet. There was a FedEd pamphlet on the table in front of him. She was a little offended that they had shown that little faith in her to have FedEd information ready. She had no right to argue, though. That was far from out of the question for her situation. "We're your parents. We'll always love you." Her mother was walking closer now. "We're on your side. We just want to see you do well." 2.4, Lizzy said. She rounded up. Before anyone could react, she picked up her bag and darted outside, not trusting the thin walls of her bedroom for peace and quiet at a time like this. It was getting dark, but she didn't care. She would spend time in the local park or something, and find a street lamp to read by. Her library card needed to be renewed, but it could also be revoked, she realized. She wanted to die. The park wasn't a far walk. It was the same one she had been walking to since she was old enough to know how to leave the front yard. It was small, just a few blocks in size, in the middle of a suburban maze. She meandered to one of her favorite benches and sat down. She had one of the Harry Potter books with her, something she'd been engrossed in for the past few weeks. However, reading was the last thing on her mind just then. Instead, she just sat for a while. Her life was over. She was only 18, and her life was over. Any dreams she had of being an author or a librarian were done. She'd be serving shitty coffee and shitty breakfast sandwiches to that dirty guy from the bank. Lizzy would be working at some gas station at 6 in the morning for the rest of her life because that was the only job that would hire someone with a social score like 2.37. She hated this country, state, and town, and the way everyone operated and how people thought, and what everyone valued in life. She hated them all. It was dark soon enough after she arrived on the clear night. The stars were visible. There wasn't a cloud in sight. She decided she would get off the bench and lie on her back on the paved walkway. The stars were beautiful. She remembered reading on the internet about how to find Orion. It was her favorite constellation, one of the few she could find quickly. It was a shame it wasn't around during the summer. Lizzy loved it all the same, and cherished one of the few links to the world outside Earth that retained the ability to mystify her. After 15 minutes, the first moment she felt calm since entering the bank, she heard footsteps approaching behind her. Her mood sunk to its previous low, then sunk a little lower. It would be a local policeman, she just knew it. Who else would be patrolling a park after dark other than a loner like her? She sat up, and sure enough, a portly man in a helmet and black vest was approaching her. "The park's closed, miss," he said to her. "Sorry, sir, I lost track of time. I'll leave," she replied. He watched her as she walked out through the patch of trees back towards the sidewalk, and didn't follow her once she was out of sight. She loved that park, and was always angry to be kicked out. This was far from the first time. Walking aimlessly, she now had no direction, either in life or just for the night. She wandered around for an hour. Lizzy made it as far as the shopping district of their small town and circled around it twice. On her third circle around, she took a different road than she normally did. A tired-looking man, dressed in many layers of clothing, sat at a bus stop, his arm guarding a backpack by his side. He was awake and alert, silently listening to her footsteps before she was in his peripheral view. She was sure it was much too late for buses to come around. She found it odd that anyone was in this shopping district right now at all. Lizzy stopped, staring at him and not realizing what she was doing. The guy must have been homeless, she realized. He stared back. The man looked like someone whose social score told the world he was exactly what he looked like. "I'd ask you for food or money, but you look sadder than me right now, girl," the man said to her. "If you're not too scared to sit and talk, I haven't had a decent conversation in a week. It gets lonely out here." He patted the empty space on the metal bench beside him, opposite to where his backpack was. Stupidly and naively, she sat down. "What's your social score?" she asked, knowing it was a rude question. "Just shy of 2.5, but the exact number is 2.43. He answered her, not treating it like it was a rude thing to ask at all. He seemed a bit proud of it, to the contrary. Though very low, she was reminded that his score was just a little higher than her own. A homeless man sitting at a bus stop in the middle of the night had been dealt a more favorable hand by the government than she had. That was almost enough to bring her to tears over the futility of her life and her future, but she was determined to keep her composure in front of this stranger. Lizzy remained silent, partially because she didn't want her voice to betray her feelings. "What's your score, girl?" Feeling dumb, she stayed quiet. "Don't feel like talking, eh?" The man turned away from her, looking straight ahead at the road in front of them. A lone automobile passed by, not a police car, just a civilian. The driver probably had a higher score than both of them put together. "Well, I bet you're wondering how I got here." He looked back at her again as he said this. His inflection made this a question, but she had a feeling she would hear his life story regardless of whether or not she asked for it. She didn't mind it. It would give her something to listen to, and maybe grant her some perspective on the things she should and shouldn't be doing at this stage in life. "All right, well, here goes. I was born over in Rhode Island, but my parents moved out here to Oneida, New York, when the new community was being built. New space to help the population crisis, you know? So I grew up out here. Don't remember Rhode Island at all." This man must be older than he looked, she realized. Oneida had been around for almost 60 years. "In middle school and high school, I was a rebel and a punk and all that. Started smoking, drank, had sex, shoplifted, said fuck the government a little too loud. All the fun stuff. I guess that's why my score got so low, eh?" She appreciated that he was at least able to talk about the issue in a light-hearted way. It gave her hope for her own future, and her ability to eventually come to terms with her life's path. Although there was still the question of her physical well-being in the future, seeing as her score was lower than that of a homeless man. "I did all that, got a bad score, shoplifted some more to eat and feed my tobacco addiction, got caught by the feds, not always the cops, mind you. It lowered my score even more, so I never got a good job. My parents eventually kicked me out because they couldn't afford a tenant who didn't contribute. The low-score tenant tax, you know. And from there I went in and out of jail a few times, where the food was at least free, and then I ended up right back here." "My score is 2.37, Lizzy said out of nowhere. She didn't know why she told him that. She just knew she was already getting bored with his story. He did immediately shut up when she told him. "You don't look the type," he said then, after a while of looking her up and down. "I don't feel the type." There was another moment of silence. "Your birthday? You just found out?" he asked. She nodded. "Well, happy birthday anyway. You should go home to your family. Appreciate them while you still have them. They'll be your best friends in this world, especially with a score like ours. You should try to improve your score where you still have their support. Do everything you can. Don't end up like me," he said. She just stared blankly. "You listening to me, girl?" he asked. "Where do you live?" She didn't answer. "Look, kid, don't stay out too late, okay? And for goodness sake, don't get yourself in trouble." She was flattered at the concern he was showing her. A little girl like her made a big, scary, hardened, homeless criminal like this man show some humanity. What a thought! She wished she could say something. Anything. She didn't like making this guy uncomfortable and worried like he was, but she couldn't think of any words to say. Eventually he stood, slinging the strap of his bag over his shoulder. She pitied him, his existence, and dreaded her own. "I'll leave you alone now, kid. I hope you end up with a better life than me. My situation was completely preventable, okay? Just follow their rules, don't do anything stupid, and you can be a respected professional with a nice family of your own one day," he said. He was almost pleading with her now. It was as if he wanted to fix his own mistakes by correcting her course. She couldn't help but find humor in that. The man walked away, and she was alone, sitting on a bench under a bus stop. After sitting for a while, she had an idea. She remembered the pen pal she'd thought about earlier, the one from Britain, she talked to about just how eager she was to join the workforce. She took out her phone, she still had the contact information, and she could call her tonight. With the different time zones, it would be very early morning for her friend across the pond. In all likelihood, Lizzy would wake her up with a call, but she didn't care. She needed someone to unload her feelings onto. Flipping the phone open and dialing the number, she wasn't rewarded with a dial tone, instead being greeted by a colorful red error message, hurting her eyes by its contrast to the dim night around her. "Elizabeth Lana Dixon, social score 2.37, minimum social score of 4.2 required to place international calls, minimum social score of 6.4 required to place calls to the United Kingdom." Shit. With her coming of age and getting a social score for the first time, stupid things like this would be kicking in for her now. She would never be able to talk to her friend again. They hadn't talked in months since drifting apart, but still, a lost friend was always a sad thing. Lizzy wondered if Clea would ever try calling her again, and what she would find if she did. Would she know that Lizzy wanted to communicate, or would she just think she was being ignored? She had a thought then. Maybe she wouldn't have to go her whole life without talking to Clea. She might just have an idea for one way around this particular restriction. For the first time since it got dark, Lizzy had a clear destination in mind. She would go to the Oneida Public Library. It was back the way she came, only a short distance from the park. She had been volunteering there to help the librarians for years. She had special access to the building. She could get in any time, day or night, and the librarians controlled that access, not the feds or the census department. She would get to keep it, she was sure, no matter what her social score looked like. It was after midnight when the building finally came into sight. The familiar U.S. flag flew on the flagpole out front, illuminated by spotlights long after dark. The 53 stars, with a characteristic 3 that didn't seem to fit neatly into the pattern, waved proudly in the slight breeze of the night. She wondered if anyone in the other 52 states felt as bad as she did on this night. She took the cobblestone path through the lawn, approaching the impressive stone building, which looked especially imposing in the middle of the night. There was a fingerprint reader that operated the locks on the door. She put a thumb on the touchpad. There was a hot sensation on the bottom of her finger, lasting only a couple of seconds. She winced before the pad cooled down, and she was rewarded with a happy-sounding electronic beep. "Elizabeth Lana Dixon," said a soothing, computerized female voice. "Volunteer assistant librarian. Access granted." The lock on the door clicked open, and Lizzy pushed her way inside. It was dark for a brief moment after the door shut. The motion-sensing lights kicked on, making her jump despite expecting them. The library never gave her the creeps before, but then again, she'd never been here this late before. She felt like she was breaking the law, even though she didn't think she was. Lizzy felt like she was about to get in trouble at any moment, as if a fed or a cop would be hiding behind any of the pillars or bookshelves. Cautiously, quietly, she walked through the large central room towards the librarian's desk, behind which was the office, both of which she had access to. Once at the desk, she knew there were security cameras on her. Probably no one would be watching them, though. The only monitor for them was in the library security room, and only a couple of people had the cameras on their phones. The library didn't have any nighttime security. Even if it did, she could probably make up a story about doing paperwork and not being able to sleep, and they would wish her a happy birthday and accept what she said without question. She lifted the barrier and crossed it to get behind the desk. She made extra effort to be as quiet as possible as she moved, even though she knew no one was there. No one could possibly be there. She was all alone here. She was scared and paranoid, and she was on edge, partially from the homeless man and the cop in the park. Most of it was from finding out her score, though. Lizzy turned the knob on the office door. It creaked open with a sound that she thought would wake the neighbors for miles around. She grimaced and opened the door just enough for her to slip inside. Then she laid eyes on her goal, the telephone on the desk. It was one of the few landlines left in town. They were usually only used in public service buildings. The thing about landlines, though, was that they didn't follow the social score restrictions because there wasn't a good way to tell who was placing the call. It would cause more problems than it was worth if they had restrictions on international calls at all. Lizzy smiled at her success as she slipped her butt onto the librarian's chair, placing her hand on the bulky telephone handle. She'd made interlibrary loan queries on this phone before, and was thankful she knew how it worked. With a burst of giddy, nervous energy, she pulled her own phone out of her pocket and double-checked for the correct number. Then she dialed it into the library phone and clicked the call button. The phone rang, and she panicked. Slamming the phone back down on its perch, Lizzy frowned. What was she doing? She hadn't talked to Clea in months, and had only ever actually heard her voice once. What would she think of Lizzy calling her up in the middle of the night like this? With the way time zones worked, she was sure she'd be waking the poor girl up. It didn't matter, she decided. She came this far, and she needed someone sympathetic to talk to. She once again keyed in the correct numbers and tried to make the call. It rang once, twice, and then she heard a shuffling sound on the other end. Hello?" the voice said. Clea lived around Stirling, Scotland, she remembered. Her accent was pleasant. It was a nice augment to her pretty speaking voice. Lizzy was a little jealous of it. It was enough to be a good novelty and probably make the boys around here give her heaps of extra attention, but not enough to make her words hard to understand. Hey, sorry," Lizzy said. Her voice was small and cracking. Was she beginning to cry? Shit. "Clea." Forming her words was an effort. She had to remind herself to say Clea's name at the end, so the British girl wouldn't just think she was a spam caller. "Thanks for getting the phone." "I suppose the question of the day is how you know my name, then." Lizzy's stomach turned all into knots. "It's Lizzy, or, I'm sorry, we never told each other our real names. I mean, it's your old pen pal from upstate New York." Despite her being on the verge of tears, Clea was laughing on the other end. "Nervous much? I know who it is, silly. I told you a nickname too, you know." "Not many people call me Clea. You think some parent out there would ever name their poor child Cleopatra?" Lizzy now was forced to laugh as well. It felt good to share a joke with her friend. It was as if this was the 1,000th time they had talked on the phone, not the first. It went a long way towards easing her mind. They were both aware that neither of them knew the other's real name. That was just how you did things safely on the internet. "So why are you calling me at almost 6 in the morning, Lana? Or I suppose it's only 1 a.m. where you're at, isn't it?" Lizzy could only grunt in agreement to this. She knew if she talked too much it would give away the fact that she was crying. The line was silent for a moment. Clea continued. "I know you wouldn't call me if it wasn't important, Lana. I'm glad I picked up. I was hoping we would get to talk again sometime." Clea's words of comfort were making the tears come even harder, and it was an effort just to keep her sobbing quiet. "Thank you," Lizzy eventually got actual words out. "Lana, are you crying?" Clea asked. Shit. Well, she knew now. She couldn't hide it any more. "Lana, tell me what's wrong. I want to help you if I can." Lizzy just sobbed more, unable to articulate a response. "Lizzy, it's okay. Whatever it is, everything will be okay." Clea's voice was soothing. Her accent was almost as much so. Clea had called her Lizzy. She had used her real name. Rather than feeling like an invasion of privacy, even that felt special. "Now that I know your name, it's only fair I tell you mine, isn't it? My real name is Leslie. Not as exciting as Cleopatra, I'm afraid." Clea paused. "I like Lizzy, though. It's short for Elizabeth, right? Your name lends itself better to nicknames than mine." After a brief quiet, she continued. "I'm sorry, I'm not doing a very good job at comforting you, Lana." "I'm sorry for being so stupid," Lizzy said. "You aren't stupid. You're a great friend, and whatever it is, I want to help you through this." "Yes, I am. I haven't talked to you in months, and now I'm waking you up early just to listen to me cry like an idiot. I'm a really shitty friend to you, Clea." "Lana." Clea paused. It sounded as if she didn't know what to say. Lizzy supposed she should take the opportunity to say something about what was actually bothering her. "I got my social score today, Clea." Clea's silence was the most frightening thing Lizzy could have expected. "I got a fucking 2.37. It's not even a 4th of 10. I'm scum. I'm trash, Clea. Homeless people have higher scores than me. I have international call restrictions. I'll have library access restrictions and travel restrictions. I tried to call you on my own phone, but they wouldn't let me. I had to go into the library and use the phone in here to call you. Lizzy." Clea sounded like she wanted to say something, but couldn't quite think of the best way to word it. Lizzy shut up and waited to hear her out. "Lizzy, they tell us in school not to talk about social scores with you. They say if we have an American pen pal, we shouldn't talk about any kind of government or politics with them at all. They say that even just telling you guys certain things, even if you don't agree or you tell us to stop, they say that it could get you in trouble. Lizzy, I don't want to get you in trouble by talking about this. Is there anyone else you can talk to?" "Leslie, please," Lizzy said. She was crying again. She felt so stupid. She thought using her friend's real name and pleading might work in getting her to listen. She didn't care about any reason Clea could come up with to avoid the topic. She just wanted to get some things off her chest. And the other girl wasn't letting her do that. "I suppose I can listen if you want to talk, but I'm scared for you, Lizzy. What if you say the wrong thing and someone hears you on the phone?" "Who's going to hear me on the phone? It's not like anyone's listening to us talk." "Lana, please." Before Clea could say what she wanted to next, the call disconnected. A loud, solid tone could be heard through the line, and Lizzy had to bring it away from her ear because the sound was loud enough to hurt. And then there were words. "This is the United States Census Department. We've detected an unlawful circumvention of score-based international calling restrictions. United States citizen, please remain where you are. A federal investigator will arrive at your location shortly to gather the facts of the situation." Lizzy froze. What was she going to do? She had broken the law. She was going to go to jail. What was she going to do now? She had to run. In under a minute, she left the library and started running as fast as she could. She avoided the park and the shopping district, trying to stay out of trouble despite running from it, not knowing where she was going. On second thought, she did know where she was going. Her feet were taking her to the beach. They were taking her to the edge of Lake Oneida, a lake she'd been countless times. It was walking distance from her house. She'd spent weekend days there, or even weekdays while skipping school, sitting on the hill above the water, watching the rich people leave their beach homes and sail their boats around. Sometimes she tried to draw the boats, or sometimes she would write songs about it. This time, she would be going there at night, trying to hide. Lizzy didn't know what she was hiding for. Her thumb was used to enter the library, her first and middle names were said on the phone call, and her fingerprints were on the phone and the door handle. The library security camera saw her. It wouldn't be hard at all for the feds to figure out who did what inside of that building. She was still crying. She got to the hill. Her backpack fell off her shoulder as she stopped and stood still. Then she had a thought. She pulled her phone out of her pocket and took out the battery. If she was trying to avoid the feds, it wouldn't do to have a GPS device powered up in her pocket. After a moment, Lizzy stuffed the parts back inside. Looking out towards the great expanse of dark water, it was illuminated only by moonlight on the waves. This was Lake Oneida, one of the 5 Great Lakes of North America. She learned in school that the Canadians called it Lake Ontario because they wanted to name it after one of their provinces, but the Americans had always called it Lake Oneida after the Native American tribe. Coincidentally, their little town was named after that same tribe. Across the water, she could see lights coming from one of those Canadian cities. She struggled to remember the name of it. She was sure it started with a T. It was funny. She was never here at night to notice the lights shining all the way across. Lizzy wondered if lights from Oneida could reach all the way to Canadian shores. She doubted it. Oneida was tiny as hell. She had to get her head back on straight. She was a criminal on the run. It was avoiding the feds now, or else she would end up in jail for the rest of her life. Looking at those lights across the water, she decided that she had no other place to go. She'd have to try to get across that lake into Canada. And she felt like she knew how to do it. She picked up her bag again and kept walking. She went west this time along the shore. There was one rich person house in particular that she had in mind. They had a shed and a dock jutting out into the water line, going out onto their own little pond, fed by the lake itself. She knew the kayaks they used were in there. There was a fence around the backyard, but she could jump it easily enough. She could steal a kayak and go to Canada with it. Stealing only made the cops angry at you, not the feds. The feds were the ones she needed to avoid right now. The house came into sight soon. Without slowing or stopping to catch her breath, she barreled over the fence and pushed open the door to the boat shed. Her frenzied motion didn't cease until she was inside with the door closed and locked behind her. Then she turned around to look at her surroundings. It was almost exactly as she expected. Fishing supplies, nets, rods, tackle boxes, life preservers, oars, and finally, 2 kayaks. One of them was pink with blue swirls, the other was yellow with blue swirls. She took the pink one off from where it was mounted on the rack. The plastic vessel wasn't as heavy as she imagined it, but it thudded to the floor loudly anyway. The adrenaline in her body tempted her to be careless, but she had to remember the people who owned this boat, this shed, and that house could wake up if they heard too much noise. She thought they had a dog, too. Fortunately, she didn't hear barking when the paddle boat thudded down. In more frantic motion, she got an oar off of its wall hooks. She had come this far, and she couldn't go back now. This was crazy. This was insane. She was fleeing her country. She was trespassing, and in the process of stealing a boat. She had made an illegal phone call to a country that had diplomatic tensions with her own. She had talked ill of the social score system on a recorded phone line. She had to run if she didn't want to go to jail. Oar in hand and fear driving her, she picked up the boat and wrestled it out onto the dock. It made a loud splashing sound in the water when she tossed it down. She was surprised that the sound didn't wake the dog up, but then again, she supposed a lot of splashing sounds came from the lake on a regular basis. Bugs swarmed around her when she stood still. She swatted angrily at them. She climbed into the boat as fast as possible, clumsily getting in and almost tipping it over. When she looked back at the United States for the last time, she saw a light in the first floor of the house. That got her heart pumping even more than before, if that was possible. And she started paddling furiously. The boat picked up speed more as she paddled. Her legs were sore from all the running, but now they were finally getting a chance to rest. She thought it was about 50 miles from here to the Canadian end of Lake Oneida. Her arms would be even more tired than her legs by the end of it. She winced in anticipation of the aching muscle she would have in the morning. If she didn't make it to Canada, she wouldn't be able to keep up this running for more than one night, she was sure of that much. Once she got to speed, though, she found this way of traveling faster than walking, yet less tiring than sprinting. She quickly reached the place where water flowed into the smaller lake from Lake Oneida, and took the kayak through with little effort. This just might work. But did she really want to do this? She was having second thoughts now that she could see how close she was to succeeding. Before she could dwell on those thoughts, though, she heard police sirens. Looking around, back on land, she saw a cop car, or maybe even a Fed car, with lights and sirens blaring. A man's voice came on the loudspeaker. "Return to shore. This is a federal investigation. Please get out of Lake Oneida immediately." Without pause, she kept on paddling with renewed fervor. As she swiftly drifted onward, the sounds of the sirens faded into the distance behind her. She didn't dare slow down, and she didn't dare pause to have second thoughts again. She just kept going. On and on she went. The water was less calm the further she went from shore, as the kayak rocked back and forth. Fortunately, she was able to keep it upright. It felt like the better part of an hour as she paddled, listening to the silence except the waves around her. She aimed for the land on the other end, pushing herself to keep on. She couldn't stop. She had to make it. She wasn't free yet, not until she was on the opposite shore and hidden far from the water. Then she heard something. It sounded like a motorboat approaching from behind her and to the right. She looked back and saw searchlights, luckily not pointed at her. Lizzy ducked down into the kayak, knowing that she couldn't outrun the thing. Her best chance was to hide from it. Waves buffeted the kayak, and a piece of driftwood even bumped lightly into it. The motorboat did a large semicircle around her, going north. She let out a breath when it became clear whoever was on the boat hadn't seen her, and kept paddling. She had to move fast under the veil of night. She had to get to some sort of safe place before dawn. Another hour passed. Water sloshed around her legs, splashing up into the kayak from the waves. Her clothing was drenched, her backpack and everything in it was damp. Her arms were sore, and she wasn't even halfway there. But she didn't stop. Then, to her right and far ahead of her, a giant searchlight came on from a large boat that was floating along. The vessel towered up 50 feet above the waves, and was at least 75 feet from front to back. Then there was another voice on a loudspeaker. "This is the Canadian Coast Guard vessel HMCS Vaudreuil. You have drifted into Canadian waters. Please let us take you aboard our ship so we can sort out the situation." Lizzy froze. She was in Canadian waters? That was more good than bad, probably. At least she thought it was. She wasn't sure. Could the Canadian Coast Guard hand her over to the feds if they asked for her? That would ruin everything. Her entire plan would be pointless. Thanks to her predicament, she had no chance of getting away from the bigger ship, especially if she was planning to go further north and land in Canada. The people on that vessel held her life in their hands. Arms tied, she stopped and finally stretched her muscles rather than paddling on. She watched them then, as a smaller boat was lowered down from the HMCS ship and landed on the waves. The motor kicked on and headed directly towards her. She wondered then if this was a Fed ship disguising itself as a Canadian ship. They wouldn't need to do that to get her, though. They had already spotted her. Whoever this was had the power to just take her without having to lie to gain her trust. The small boat came up right next to her. "How'd you end up all the way out here, then?" a man said. He was handsome, young, and reminded her of the guy from the bank earlier. Presently he leaned over the side, offering her a hand to climb up. Freezing, damp, exhausted, and terrified, she was stunned into silence. Pushing the oar to the side, it splashed into the water, floating away from her. She didn't care. Not like she would need it anymore. Then, once that object was out of her way, she tried to grab the man's hand. Footing shaky, the kayak almost tipped over when she climbed out. Lizzy let the Coast Guard man pull her up onto the motorboat. "Do you care about the kayak?" another man asked. It was the driver of the boat, not the one that helped her aboard. Shaking her head no, the driver nodded, and the engine revved up again, heading once more towards the bigger boat. There were more sirens and spotlights behind them suddenly. Lizzy jumped out of her skin. "This is the United States Coast Guard. You are currently apprehending an American citizen. Please stand down and allow us to take our citizen home." Both the men on the boat looked at her. "Please don't make me go back," she said. They made no move to stop the boat or turn around. The driver clicked a button on the walkie-talkie beside him and spoke into it. "Code yellow," he said. A moment later, a loudspeaker from the Canadian ship started up. "United States, this is the HMCS Vaudreuil. Be advised you have crossed into Canadian waters. You are a military force that is trespassing in foreign territory. You have no jurisdiction here. Please return home." The girl felt a pang of hope when she heard this. They were closer to the Vaudreuil now. Maneuvering next to it, they affixed the boat to hooks dangling down for them. The small boat was then lifted up onto the bigger one by an electric crank. "Vaudreuil, we'd like to invoke the treaty of 2047. We request you allow one of our negotiators on board your ship to talk to the American you've kidnapped." The American loudspeaker toned. The man that pulled her out of the kayak scoffed and shook his head. "Kidnapping Americans. What we do is save them." The crank gradually raised the rest of the way up to the top, onto the ship's deck. "United States, we will allow this request. We await your negotiator." And again, Lizzy's heart sank. She was going through quite the emotional roller coaster on this night, and things just kept escalating. She found herself wanting sleep and warmth and dry clothes more than anything else. The Canadians sat her under a roof inside the ship as a light drizzle started to come down on top of them. She was suddenly thankful for being picked up. Paddling for miles in the rain would have been hell. The room had a table and several chairs in it, but it was otherwise empty. "What happens now?" she asked one of the Canadians from the motorboat who had come inside with her. "Situations like this happen a couple times a week. According to that Treaty of 47, they get to send someone over to try and convince you to go back to America. If you agree to go, we let you leave. If you don't, the U.S. Coast Guard has to turn around and get out of our water before we have a diplomatic incident over them trespassing," said the man who lifted her out of the water. Her situation finally came into perspective. She remembered learning about the US-UK war, of which Canada played a large part, in history class, and she remembered briefly reading about that treaty, but she never thought too long or hard about what was inside it. She learned enough to pass the test, then forgot it as soon as she no longer needed the information. "So what happens to me if I don't want to go back?" Lizzy asked. "Canada has programs to house American refugees till they can get on their feet. There's a whole apartment buildings in Toronto just for that. You guys become minor celebrities a lot of times. People love when you go on talk shows and tell stories about some of the things your government is making happen. I shouldn't get ahead of myself, though. You have to talk to that negotiator first. Just remember, we won't leave you in a bad way if you do decide to come to Canada." She nodded. She had no idea what the future held for her if she went to Toronto, but she knew she wouldn't like staying in Oneida. She didn't have to wait too much longer. Bright lights illuminated a helicopter as it took off from the deck of the American ship. In seconds it made its way over to the deck of the Vaudreuil. It was loud. She pressed her hands against her ears to block out the noise. Then a man wearing a suit, clear safety glasses, ear protection, and a rain poncho stepped off the helicopter. Canadians with guns surrounded the vehicle, but did not raise their weapons, letting the man through. The two Canadians from the small motorboat remained in the room with Lizzy the whole time. The man in the rain poncho was invited through the door to the windowed room, and as he stepped through, he was dripping wet. The rain must have picked up a lot in the last few minutes since she was outside. He removed his hood, pulling the plastic garment over his head and laying it to dry on a nearby chair. Pulling off his glasses and earplugs, he set them on the table. Finally, he faced Lizzy in another chair. Those two Canadians were still on either side of her. She was glad they stayed. She felt safer with them there. They were probably the only ones who had a chance of saving her from the feds. "Can I call you Lizzy?" the man asked. His manner of speaking wasn't blunt or harsh like how she expected a fed to treat a criminal like her, but rather friendly and unassuming. He sounded like he wanted to have a real conversation with her. "Sure," she said to him. "Thank you, Lizzy. My name is Samuel Connor, and it's my job to bring you back home. You want to see your family again, don't you?" This caught her off guard. They knew about her family? Of course they knew about her family, but hearing a Fed mention them to her made her worry. "Sorry, I didn't mean anything malicious," he continued. "We won't harm them at all. We just want you to succeed, all of you, your whole family, and every member of our nation. We want the whole country to succeed, and that can only happen when individuals like you do well. You have so much to offer the country, a whole lifetime, and we have so much to offer you. We can be very forgiving of people who've had a rough start with things. We know every human being who is born with the American spirit has great potential. We just need to unlock that potential within you." With this much, he paused to give her time to respond. His facial expression was non-threatening, and seemed to invite a response, but all she could think about was the physical comforts she was missing. "You won't hurt them?" she asked. "They'll be just fine, and so will you. We won't even send you to jail, Lizzy. All you have to do is sign up for a year in the Federal Education and Civics program, and you can be one happy family again as soon as we're able to get you back in your own bed." A year of Fed Ed. That was the deal. She would get to see her parents and her little brother every day, avoid jail, and get to sleep at home every night. All she had to do was go to some civics camp for adults and get told how to swallow her pride and work a job she hated for the rest of her life. To be told creativity was useless, that art and music and poetry were a waste of time at best, and a way to spread civil unrest at worst. She would be told that reading was for useless people with too much free time, but TV nights with the family after a 10-hour workday was somehow better. For the last few years of her school career, that was her greatest fear. Lizzy would be forced to erase part of her personality, part of her identity, just to fit in and be a good member of society. To add insult to injury, the feds would try to have her thinking that not sending her to jail was somehow generous. This was all assuming Samuel Connor was telling her the truth. "You're not the only one to act out and do something regretful after finding out for the first time they've had a bad score, you know. I have a story for you, Lizzy, if you'll listen." Though tired, she nodded, and he continued. The man was very good at keeping her attention, if nothing else. "Thank you for listening, Lizzy." She really wanted to believe that this man cared about her, but her brain stubbornly kept all her doubts at the forefront of her mind. An internal battle raged inside her thoughts. "My score on my 18th birthday was 2.01. That was only 14 years ago." At her raised eyebrow, he smiled reassuringly. "I'm not lying, Lizzy." She looked him in the eye, and she believed that his social score had at one point been lower than hers. "Lizzy, I grew up in Wilmington, Delaware. I went to an inner-city school. My grades weren't good. I skipped class. I talked bad about the federal system." He began unbuttoning his shirt. She could only sit there in silence, watching and listening. "When I was 17, I tried to steal a car. Enough the buttons were undone that he could pull the shirt open. Got in a fight with a cop." Samuel pulled the right side of his shirt wide open for her to see a sizable scar across his ribs. "And he gave me this so I could remember what I did wrong and why I shouldn't have done it. That there should have been my wake-up call, but it wasn't, because I was stupid." He rebuttoned his shirt. "When the bank teller told me my score for the first time, I was mad, but I wasn't surprised. I went off that night and smashed the windows on 5 cars with a hammer from my dad's toolbox, just because I was angry at the world. Cops caught me again, of course, but my parents bailed me out. The next day, I went back to that bank teller to talk about my early adult life options like I should have done before going and smashing up other people's stuff, and you know what they told me?" Lizzy thought she knew the answer. "Fed Ed," she said. That seemed to be the U.S. government's magical answer to every bad thing that happens in your life because of a low social score. That was ignoring the fact that if the social score system didn't exist, none of those manufactured problems would exist in the first place. "No, not Fed Ed, Lizzy. How do you think I got where I am now?" He paused for half a second, a knowing smile on his face as he watched her begin to comprehend. "They told me to join the military. Told me my crimes would be forgiven, restitution for those cars would be paid by Uncle Sam instead of my parents. Told me they would make me a better person, help me completely reset my score, make me someone who I could be proud of, rather than someone who does bad stuff and gets picked up by cops all the time. And you know what? I picked the Coast Guard, and a few years later, all that came true. My score was 6.14 on my next birthday, and my score now is 9.03. In fact," he said, he pulled out his cell phone from his pocket, My score is enough that I can make international calls to nations that have a tense diplomatic relationship with the U.S. If you want, after we get back off this Leaf ship, I can call up that Scottish friend of yours so you can tell her everything's going to be alright. You can tell her that you'll be able to call her again in a year from now because you're going to work hard and turn your life around. The Census Department will know if you've made a true effort at it, and they'll reward you. Like I said, Uncle Sam wants everyone to do well, Lizzy. When the individual thrives, the nation thrives. Lizzy couldn't take her eyes off that phone suddenly. She realized that she had indeed left Leslie, a.k.a. Clea, wondering if she was in serious trouble. Hanging up abruptly would have been bad enough, but had she heard those words on the line about circumventing a call restriction, she would probably have been seriously worried. Lizzy felt immensely stupid for letting her friend down like that, not to mention her parents, her brother, and everyone she knew from school and town. None of them would know where she was. They would all miss her, and they would all be worried about her. "Will I be happy, though?" she asked him. She didn't even know what she meant by that. When she thought about it more, she might have meant to ask if she would be happy with herself and the amount of individuality that she would lose in Fed Ed. The man in front of her looked like his score told the world he was exactly who he looked like. Would Lizzy's score one day tell the world the same thing? That she had no more emotional depth than that dirty man from the bank, or someone who got paid to talk runaways into Fed Ed? She didn't like that thought. "What do you mean? Of course you'll be happy. You'll be working for your goals and achieving the life that you want. You'll be living the way you want to live," Samuel said. "I'll be living the way the Census Department wants me to live." He pursed his lips and gathered himself, as if rethinking his strategy. She saw now that this was all just a strategy to him. His goal was to persuade her to return to America, where they would be able to put her in prison, or in Fed Ed, or wherever they wanted to put her. Anywhere they put her, even back in her old home, it would feel like a prison if she wasn't free to live her life however she wanted. If she wasn't free to be a different person between her work life and her home life. If she wasn't free to have enough time away from work to keep her sane, what was the point? Everyone told her that if you find a job you love, it wouldn't feel like work, but she knew that line was bullshit. She couldn't think of any adult she knew that really loved their job. They all complained, they all looked melancholy going into work, they all looked tired coming out of it, and they all slept and started the process all over again in the morning. And they called that a life. Lizzy didn't want that life for herself. The Census Department isn't telling you which path to take, you have to choose that for yourself. But no matter what you do, making yourself better always requires work. Personal improvement isn't easy. It means tossing aside quick gratification and getting into habits that will pay off in the long run, and then sticking to those habits, never falling out of them. You can do whatever you want in life, but you'll still have to discipline yourself if you want to be a better person. That much will be true no matter which country you decide to go to. This man didn't understand what she was asking at all. She had no objection to putting effort into self-improvement, but she doubted whether any job she found in the United States would allow her to work towards her own ends. Everything was raise the GDP, or help fellow citizens, or improve the community for your neighbors. Those were all well and good and noble goals, but none of them excited her. The spark inside her that she could feel when she drew, or read a good book, or thought about maybe writing a book of her own, was never ignited by anything any Fed or any teacher had ever told her. That's what Samuel Connor failed to grasp. "I'm sure your family wants you to be around so they can help you, and so they can see where you'll go in life," he continued. And suddenly, she had completely forgotten that train of thought. She was crying like a stupid little baby again. What was she thinking running away? She would never see any of her family or friends again. She would never see her home or her hometown again, or the library or the librarians or anyone or anything else she had ever known. She would never see the inside of the United States ever again. She would always be a foreigner wherever she went from now on. Unless she accepted Samuel's deal tonight. Could she do it? Could she bear it? Could she forgive herself if she did? She knew that, if she did, the feds would constantly be watching her to make sure she didn't try to escape again. If she wanted to go to Canada, this would be her very last chance to do it. So much depended on this one decision. "Take as much time as you need to decide, Lizzy. I can answer any more questions that you have."